Hello and welcome back to another video. Let us discuss today the secure synopsis of 1st of May 2021. Let us read out some of the question and answers in this secure synopsis. So this is the 1st of May 2021. The first topic is under general studies 2. In the unparalleled pandemic, vaccine development and vaccine administration are time-strained challenges. In this context, suggest non-vaccine interventions to avoid, monitor and treat COVID-19. So this is a reference from the Times of India, and let us read out the answer to this question. In late 2019, a novel coronavirus, now designated SARS-CoV-2, was identified as the cause of an outbreak of acute respiratory illness in Wuhan, a city in the Hubei province of China. Now, India is in the second wave of pandemic, which is more like a tsunami than a wave. With low vaccine supplies, non-vaccine intervention is equally needed to contain the pandemic going out of hand. Let us have a look at the vaccine development. First is the target validation of the vaccine. Then you have a preclinical stage. Then you have translational medicine. Then you have manufacturing, initial bioprocesses, formulation and analytics, all those formula and whatever is needed, and the data collection and data testing and all happens. Then you have the clinical assay optimization of the vaccine. Then you go to the first phase where you will take in a limited number of people. Then you go to the second phase where you take a little more number of people. And finally, when you go to the phase 3 stage, you will be vaccinating a huge amount of population to understand the adverse effects of the vaccine. Now, let us have a look at the challenges in vaccine development and administration. Vaccine development is uniquely challenging when compared with development of other product modalities such as small molecules. A vaccine construct is not a laboratory synthesized chemical moiety, but a modified live virus or bacterium or a component thereof that is intended to induce a protective immune response in a healthy individual. Therefore, the manufacturing process for vaccine inherently involves growth and modification of live organisms or their components or recombinant protein expression in a live cell line. As candidate vaccines progress to clinical trials, another universal challenge is that the target populations are healthy individuals. Therefore, the benefit risk assessment differs from that of a therapeutic agent that is being administered on an ill patient. The bar for demonstrating safety is high, and the safety profile must be acceptable to regulators, ethics committees, policymakers, parents, and individuals receiving the vaccines. Large clinical trials with several thousand subjects are needed pre-licensure to establish the safety profile and inform the benefit risk assessment for using the vaccine broadly. Further, safety must continue to be monitored post licensure for detection of uncommon adverse events that may not have been detected in pre-licensure studies. Vaccine administration issues, supply side challenges, wastage, vaccine hesitancy, intellectual property rights, and profit oriented pharma companies, WTO TRIPS regulation barring generics. In certain places, the COVID-19 vaccine effort has hit a few speed bumps. Stockpiles have accumulated, and deployment to vulnerable countries and at-risk groups has been slower than expected. To arrive at the post-pandemic era in which populations experience herd immunity, vast numbers of dedicated individuals will need to continue working intensely in the months and years ahead. Let us have a look at the non-vaccine intervention to treat and prevent COVID-19 and how it can be done. Early screening, diagnosis, isolation, and treatment are necessary to prevent further spread. Preventive strategies are focused on the isolation of patients and careful infection control, including appropriate measures to be adopted during the diagnosis and the provision of clinical care to an infected patient. The most important strategy for the population to undertake is to frequently wash their hands and use portable hand sanitizer and avoid contact with their face and mouth after interacting with a possibly contaminated environment. To reduce the risk of transmission in the community, individuals should be advised to wash hands diligently, practice respiratory hygiene, that is, cover their cough, and avoid crowds and close contact with ill individuals if possible. Social distancing is advised, particularly in locations that have community transmission. Many countries have installed quarantine and social or physical distancing as measures to prevent the further spread of the virus. These measures can include the full or partial closure of educational institutions and workplaces, limiting the number of visitors and limiting the contact between the residents of confined settings such as long-term care facilities and prisons, cancellation, prohibition, and restriction of mass gatherings and smaller meetings, mandatory quarantine of buildings or residential areas. To reduce COVID-19 transmission from potentially asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people, the ECDC recommends the use of face masks. The use of face masks in the community may primarily serve as a means of source control. This measure can be particularly relevant in epidemic situations when the number of asymptomatic but infectious persons in the community can be assumed to be high. Quarantine is one of the oldest and most effective tools of controlling communicable diseases outbreaks. Conclusion: identification of most affected geographical regions and extending lockdowns there Intensifying surveillance testing, more strict monitoring of cases, and isolation of infected people is required. There will be an overall reduction of infection in the country if the spread of the infection from these high intensity regions can be arrested. Analyze the potential areas of development of relationship between India and Japan. Let us have a look at the answer to this question. This is with respect to India and Japan and the relationship that India and Japan holds. The friendship between India and Japan has a long history rooted in spiritual affinity and strong cultural civilization ties. India and Japan established diplomatic relations on 28 April 1952. Japan is regarded as a key partner in India's economic transformation. In the recent past, India-Japan relationship has transformed to a partnership of great substance and purpose. Japan's interest in India is increasing due to a variety of reasons, including India's large and growing market and its resources, especially the human resources. India-Japan bilateral relation. Within India, Japan has been a leading financial donor in the form of ODA, that is Official Development Assistance to India. It continues to maintain a high degree of interest and support for India's mega infrastructure projects like the Delhi-Mumbai Freight Corridor, Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, Chennai-Bangalore Industrial Corridor, and Ahmedabad-Mumbai High-Speed Rail. Outside India, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor announced in 2017 and joint projects in some other countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar and Sri Lanka and in Africa as well will be taken jointly. Defense ties quadrilateral security dialogue is a strategic dialogue between India, United States, Japan and Australia, and this will be carried out. Malabar exercise has been carried by India, Japan and USA on a continuous basis. Australia also wants to join this Malabar exercise. 2+2 dialogue at the defense and foreign minister level. Potential areas of development. In spite of CEPA, that is India-Japan trade, it has not produced the anticipated results. In 2011-12, the total volume of bilateral trade was $18 billion, but it declined to $13 billion during 2016 and 17. The defense technology sharing is still a thorn. The US-2 amphibian aircraft has been on the back burner. Both have diverging interest with respect to regional comprehensive economic partnership. Both countries do not have a specific China policy. India and Japan need to strengthen their naval power vis-a-vis China and hasten the pending projects in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean respectively. What's the way forward? It is clear that the government has set India-Japan ties on an accelerated geopolitical course. There will be a major factor in its dealings with the rest of the world, especially China, at a time when the US is perceived to be retreating from the region. However, the strategic partnerships needs stronger economic ties. While Japan is India's largest donor and the third largest provider of FDI, bilateral trade has steadily declined since 2013. Today, India-Japan trade languishes at around $15 billion, a quarter of trade with China, while Japan-China trade is around $300 billion. The two countries have decided to boost defense ties given the escalating tension in the region in the wake of the nuclear test by North Korea and China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. However, certain issues still remain like sharing of the defense technology, delay of US-2 amphibian aircraft. Both countries need to work on trade, defense and regional issues. A strong Indo-Japan will arrest the inconsistency being witnessed in the region, thus contributing to peace and prosperity in the region and the world. Let's move on to the next question. Discuss the factors responsible for the poor mental health of young population, that is me and you, amidst pandemic, and suggest solutions to address the same. This is basically about mental health, and this is a hidden pandemic. Basically, nobody knows what's happening. So needless to say, the pandemic and consequent lockdown have had a profound impact on mental health and well-being, especially among the youth. Adults across the world, including India, are reporting a fourfold increase in anxiety and depressive symptoms. The poor mental health of young amidst pandemic reasons. Government policies of social distancing, quarantines, travel restrictions, and cancellations of schools and large gatherings has sparked perpetual fear, panic, anxiety, confusion, anger, and depression. People are afraid of infection, dying, and losing family members. The economic factors are pandemic has severely hit the business cycles and economy. People mainly in the unorganized sector are under constant fear of losing their businesses, jobs, or savings, which has spiked the frustration, anxiety, distress level amongst them. Stigma against healthcare workers, people who tested positive, elderly, and people with existing health conditions. Children and adolescents are exacerbated by family stress, social isolation, with some facing increased abuse, disrupted education, and uncertainty about the future. Women, as per a survey recorded by UN, 66% of Indian women reported being stressed due to additional duties of caregiving, such as human schooling, that is homeschooling, and taking care of older relatives, along with increased cases of violence towards them. Role of media, with repeated media images of severely ill people, dead bodies and coffins, frequent misinformation and rumors about the virus, people are developing knowledge that they may not have the opportunity to say goodbye to dying loved ones and may not be able to hold funerals for them. Limited access to mental health care services. India's formal mental health care health system has a limited number of specialists, 9,000 psychiatrists for 1.3 billion people. This access has now been further diminished due to COVID-19 as it has disrupted services throughout the country, adversely affecting persons with pre-existing mental health issues. Mental health and psychosocial support delivered at the community level have also been critically impacted. For instance, groups, associations, and community based initiatives that used to bring people together regularly, example, senior citizens clubs, youth groups, etc., offering social support, meaning, and a sense of belonging, have not been able to meet for several months. Solutions to address the same. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare also issued guidelines minding our minds during the COVID-19 to deal with the mental health issues. Mano Darpan, an initiative by the Ministry of Human Resource Development as part of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan to provide psychological support and counseling to students, teachers, and families for mental health and emotional well-being. Investing in mental health. According to estimates, 93,000 crore will be needed to implement MHCA, that 2017. This could come from a PM Cares Fund, corporate social responsibility initiatives, private equity, and perhaps a new national lottery. Digitally mediated therapy and telepsychiatry should be scaled up. For example, Nimhans runs a successful telepsychiatry intervention in Karnataka. Mental health startups and innovations that tap technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and chatbots must be promoted for increasing awareness and access of services. Building resilience amongst adolescents and young children, a systematic approach is needed to build the demand for mental well-being, just as we broadly introduced sports into schools in the late 1990s. For this, Rashtriya Kishore Swasthya Karyakram National Adolescent Health Program has been reconfigured to include outreach by counselors, facility-based counseling, social and behavioral change. What is the conclusion over here? Sustaining and strengthening mental health services and programs must be a priority to address current and future mental health needs and help prevent a rise in mental ill health in the future. Large public engagement campaign is needed to increase help seeking that is also supported by state governments and endorsed by influential people. Mainstream media and social media giants can be roped in to create and spread awareness. Let's move on to the next topic, that is General Studies 3. Examine the various ways of controlling inflation in India. Also discuss RBI's role in controlling inflation. Very important one. Let's read out the answer to this question. The RBI's explicit mandate is to conduct monetary policy. The primary objective of monetary policy is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth. Price stability is a necessary precondition to sustainable growth. Let's move on to the body of this answer. Various ways of controlling inflation in India. First one is monetary policy. Higher interest rates reduce demand in the economy, leading to lower economic growth and lower inflation. Control of money supply. Monetarists argue that there is a close link between money supply and inflation. Therefore, controlling money supply can control inflation. Supply side policies. Policies to increase the competitiveness and efficiency of the economy, putting downward pressure on long-term costs. Fiscal policy, a higher rate of income tax could reduce spending, demand, and inflationary pressures. Wage controls, trying to control wages could, in theory, help to reduce inflationary pressures. However, apart from the 1970s, it has been rarely used. A role of RBI in inflation management. Performing open market operations refers to one of the important methods used by the central bank to reduce the credit creation capacity of commercial banks. The central bank issues government securities to commercial banks and certain private businesses. This way, the cash with the commercial banks would be spent on purchasing government securities. As a result, commercial bank would reduce credit supply for the general public. Monetary policy review by changing reserve ratios involves increase or decrease in reserve ratios by the central bank to reduce the credit creation capacity of commercial banks. For example, when the central bank needs to reduce the credit creation capacity of commercial banks, it increases cash reserve ratio. As a result, commercial banks need to keep a large amount of cash as reserve from their total deposits with the central bank. This would further reduce the lending capacity of commercial banks. Consequently, the investment by individuals in an economy would also reduce. In 2016, the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934 was amended to provide a statutory basis for the implementation of a flexible inflation targeting framework, where the center and the RBI would review and agree upon a specific inflation target every 5 years. Under this, 4% was set as the consumer price index inflation target for the period from August 5, 2016 to March 31st, 2021, with the upper tolerance limit of 6% and the lower tolerance limit of 2%. Conclusion. To the extent that ensuring price stability is its primary goal, the RBI through its MPC must constantly assess not just current levels of inflation and prices of various goods and services in the economy, but also take into consideration inflation expectations both of consumers and financial markets so as to use an array of monetary tools, including interest rates, to contain inflation within its target range. Expediting climate finance to deal with climate change related risks still remains a key challenge in the developing countries. In this background, discuss the prospects of climate financing in India. Climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. Climate finance is needed for mitigation because large scale investments are required to significantly reduce emissions. Climate finance is equally important for adaptation as significant financial resources are needed to adapt to the adverse effects and reduce the impacts of a changing climate. Background: the Global Environment Facility has served as an operating entity of the financial mechanism since the Convention's treaty into force in 1924. At Copenhagen COP15 in 2009 under Copenhagen Accord, developed countries committed to provide developing countries with scaled up, new, and additional predictable and adequate funding with a target of mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 from a wide variety of sources, public and private, bilateral and multilateral, including alternative sources of finance. Furthermore, governments committed to establish the Green Climate Fund through which a significant portion of this financing should flow. At COP16 2010, parties established the Green Climate Fund, and in 2011 it also designated it as an operating entity of the financial mechanism. Challenge of expediting climate finance in developing countries: amounts are not at all sufficient. For instance, global annual fossil fuel subsidies together with their externalities cost about $5.3 trillion. An Adaptation Watch report found that of over 5,000 adaptation projects worth $10.1 billion supported by OECD countries, three-quarters lacked a clear connection to addressing vulnerability to climate change. Although countries agreed at Katowice COP24 to initiate formal discussion on the new post-2025 mobilization goal in 2020, countries such as India believe that a decision to initiate deliberations is weaker than a decision to start the process of setting this goal. Even 10 years after COP15, there is no commonly agreed universal definition of what type of finance can be counted as climate finance in support of the Copenhagen Pledge under GCF. There is a disagreement on a whole set of qualitative and normative criteria that should provide the framework for how public climate finance is mobilized, governed, and disbursed. These include questions such as the additionality or predictability of climate finance. Prospects of climate financing in India. The Indian government recently announced the enhancement of solar energy targets under the National Solar Mission to 100 gigawatts by 2019 as compared to the initial aim of 22 gigawatts by 2022, targeting nearly $100 billion in renewable energy investments over the next 5 years. It also established a National Adaptation Fund with an initial funding of Rs 100 crore as budgetary support towards climate change. While this flurry of activity indicates a commitment on part of the government towards low carbon and climate resilience development, it also establishes a strong case for identifying the existing and future sources of climate finance to support such initiatives. The RBI has noted the importance of climate-related financial disclosures and private green finance as necessary to generate the enormous amounts of investments as required to combat climate change and bring about a transformation towards sustainable and low carbon development. Let's conclude the answer. There still doesn't exist an operational definition of what counts as climate finance or new or additional. Clarifying these definitional and accounting issues in a consultative way with an eye on post-2025 actions would go a long way towards increasing trust and scaling up a collective action. Let's move on to the next topic, General Studies 4. There is a higher court than courts of justice, and that is the Court of Conscience. It supersedes all other courts. Analyse. Conscience is the part of one's personality that helps in determining right and wrong and keeps one from acting upon the most basic urges and desires. It is what makes us feel guilty when we do something bad and good when we do something kind. Our conscience is the moral basis that helps guide pro-social behavior and leads us to behave in socially acceptable and even altruistic ways. The Court of Conscience, while law focuses on principles of morality outside human beings, conscience is something within human beings that determines the morality of human actions. Conscience is a special act of the mind that comes into being when the intellect passes judgment on the goodness or badness of a particular act. It is practical judgment on particular concrete human actions. From a deontological perspective, conscience is a judgment, an act of the intellect. It is not a feeling or an emotion, but rather an intellectual decision. It is also a decision with a view to a particular action. Conscience can make a practical judgment on the morality of either a past action or an action about to occur. Conscience is different from law. Law states a general rule concerning actions. Conscience lays down a practical rule for specific action. Conscience applies the law or rule to specific actions. Therefore, it is wider than law. Some have said that conscience is to law as a brush is to paint. Conscience can aid in decision making, especially where discretion needs to be exercised by the civil servants. Every civil servant is expected to uphold equality, work with integrity, and in good conscience, especially when he or she has a lot of discretion. The ultimate goal must be welfare of the larger community. Ethics scrutinizes the criteria for adjudicating human actions as right or wrong. What are the various sources of ethical guidance for a civil servant? And we need to explain this question. And for this, there is an answer. Let's have a look at the answer. High ethical standards for exercise of authority by a civil servant are a prerequisite. It helps a civil servant to navigate in turbulent times. An individual can take clues from laws, rules, regulation, and conscience to ensure that his or her action, behavior, and conduct is based on a sound ethical framework. Various sources of ethical guidance for a civil servant: laws of the nation, rules and regulations, code of conduct in workplace, conscience. Let's start with conscience. Ultimately, not every action can be governed by law or rules. It is our conscience that will keep us from doing immoral acts. For example, sanctity of marriage can be kept intact by practicing fidelity. Code of conduct in workplace: every organization can determine its own set of values and rules to be followed by its employees. For instance, an environment NGO can find it unacceptable that one of its employees is littering and using plastic bags. For every behavior, action can be judged upon through code of conduct. Rules and regulation: today's world works on rules and legal procedures. Every aspect of life, starting from registration of birth to death, and in many nations, social aspects such as marriages are also governed by rules and regulations. Laws of the nation: sometimes certain standards are imposed on the society through laws which over time are accepted by society and forms part of its ethical system. For instance, sati was banned in India in 1829 even though it was a part of societal norm. Significance for a public servant: laws can help to lessen corruption, nepotism, and profit seeking behavior, thus, provoke them to act in benevolence of society at large and uphold the Constitution and its principles. In another context, laws keep the society from breaking down in terms of crimes, law, and order. It regulates the conduct of people with each other and enables us to respect each other's rights. Regulation creates limits, constrains a right, creates or limits a duty, or allocates a responsibility. Regulations are intended for providing a detailed and intricate framework for making the laws work. For example, the Maradu construction and its demolition, judiciary had to take the extreme step and order the demolition as per the regulation. This Maradu happened in Kerala. Thus, regulations provide a clear path and direction in public life. Code of conduct are designed for specific situations similar to customs but have immense importance because there is usually a punishment related with them. Example, a public servant cannot ask for favors in return for doing a work that is expected out of him. Conscience is the intrinsic, intuitive capacity to discriminate between right and wrong. Inner voice is important, especially in a democracy, as it has various participants such as citizens, NGOs, corporates to be administered by politicians who are elected by them only. Conclusion: with the current declining trust in government and democracy in general, citizens are asking for more ethical behaviors from public officials. Many organizations have identified ethics and anti corruption as critical to a country's successful development and good governance.